What would you do if you stumbled upon something that was never meant to be found? Some doors should stay closed, but curiosity has a way of unlocking nightmares. Get ready for 4 terrifying stories of haunted objects discovered after moving in. I never believed in haunted houses, cursed objects, or any of those eerie stories people tell each other late at night. I always thought fear came from within, a product of our own anxieties, our own minds playing tricks on us. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some things don't need ghosts to be terrifying. Some things carry their own weight, their own history, and when you stumble upon them, they drag you down with them. It started when I moved into my new home. It was nothing fancy, just an old house in a quiet town, the kind of place where the past lingers in the woodwork and the walls creak with age. It had been empty for a while before I bought it, abandoned by the previous owners under circumstances that were never fully explained. The real estate agent had been vague, something about financial trouble, maybe a divorce. None of it mattered to me. I was ready for a fresh start, a new place, a new beginning. I thought I had left everything behind, but the house had other plans for me. The first discovery was in the basement. I had never been particularly fond of basements, too damp, too dark, too forgotten. But as I started cleaning out the space, I noticed a trunk pushed into the farthest corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. It was an old steamer trunk, the kind travelers used in the early 1900s, its leather straps cracked with time. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another piece of junk left behind, but something about it felt deliberate, as if it had been placed there, hidden away, not to be found. The latch was stiff, rusted from years of neglect, but after some effort, it gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside there were clothes, old, musty and moth-eaten, along with a few personal belongings. A pocket watch, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and at the very bottom, something that made my stomach turn. A small wooden box wrapped tightly in oilcloth. My hands hesitated before reaching for it, some unspoken instinct warning me against it. But curiosity won, as it always does. I unwrapped it carefully, feeling the coarse texture of the fabric beneath my fingers, and then I lifted the lid. Inside there was a doll. Now, I know what you're thinking. A creepy old doll in a forgotten trunk. It sounds like the beginning of every bad horror movie ever made. But it wasn't the doll itself that unnerved me. It was the craftsmanship. It wasn't porcelain or fabric. It was carved from wood, every feature meticulously shaped by hand. Its eyes were painted with such precision that they seemed to hold something more than mere pigment. And then there was the detail that made my breath catch in my throat. Its hair. It wasn't synthetic. It wasn't thread. It was human. I didn't sleep that night. The doll sat on my kitchen table watching me as I tried to make sense of it. I told myself it was just an odd antique, a relic of the past that had been tucked away and forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. Objects carry stories. They absorb history. And this one had been hidden for a reason. Over the next few days, I tried to learn more about the house, about its previous owners. I visited the local library, searched through old newspaper archives, even spoke to a few neighbors. What I found was unsettling. The house had changed hands more times than I could count, each owner staying only a few years before moving away suddenly. Some left without selling, abandoning the property entirely. There were no reports of ghosts, no whispered tales of hauntings, just a series of people who had lived there and then, inexplicably, left. But one name stood out: Margaret Holloway. Margaret had lived in the house in the 1950s. She was a woodworker, known for crafting beautiful, lifelike dolls. But something had happened, something no one liked to talk about. The newspaper articles mentioned a missing child, a little girl who had vanished without a trace. There was no evidence, no suspects, no explanation. And then, a few months later, Margaret had left town. Some said she had gone mad. Others claimed she had been driven away. No one knew for sure. I looked at the doll again, now sitting on my mantel. Its carved lips were painted into the faintest smile. its head tilted just slightly as if listening. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of a story that had been lost to time. Was it possible? Could it be? The thought made my skin crawl. I needed to get rid of it. That night, I took the doll outside, walked to the edge of the property, and buried it beneath a thick bed of earth. I told myself it was over, that I had done the right thing. But the next morning, when I walked into my living room, the doll was there. Not on the mantel where I had left it, not in the trunk where I had found it. It was sitting on the floor, right in the middle of the room, as if waiting. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in curses, but I do believe in history. Some things are not meant to be found, some stories should remain buried, and some objects, no matter how innocent they seem, carry the weight of something far heavier than we can understand. I moved out a week later. My first home purchase was nothing special. A modest 3-bedroom house in Riverside, California, built in the early 2000s. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had moved to a retirement community in Arizona. Everything about the sale was completely normal, though I did wonder why they left behind so much of their old furniture. The realtor explained they wanted to buy all new things for their retirement, which made sense at the time. The first few weeks were uneventful, just the usual stress of moving and unpacking. The house needed some updating, but nothing major, mostly cosmetic stuff like replacing the old carpet and repainting the walls. I decided to start with the guest bedroom, which had this awful beige carpet that smelled like it had been there since the house was built. I remember it was a Sunday morning when I started pulling up the carpet. The padding underneath was in surprisingly good condition, but something caught my eye. There was a portion of the subfloor that looked slightly different from the rest. It was maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, and the wood had a different grain pattern. When I knocked on it, the sound was hollow, unlike the rest of the floor. After some careful prying with a crowbar, I managed to lift the section of plywood. Underneath was a space about 2 feet deep, and what I found inside still makes me uncomfortable to think about. There were dozens of VHS tapes, carefully arranged in rows, each labeled with dates ranging from 2003 to 2008. Next to them was a stack of spiral notebooks filled with handwritten notes. I probably should have called the police right away, but curiosity got the better of me. I still had an old VCR in storage, so I hooked it up to my TV and played one of the tapes. What I saw wasn't violent or graphic. It was far more disturbing than that. The tape showed the interior of a house, not mine, but another one in what looked like a similar neighborhood. The footage was taken from outside, through windows, showing a family going about their daily routines. Cooking dinner, watching TV, putting kids to bed. The notebooks were even worse. They contained detailed descriptions of the people in the videos, their schedules, habits, conversations, overheard through open windows. Some entries described what the children wore to school or what time the parents left for work. The writing was meticulous, almost like a scientist taking notes for a research project. When I finally called the police, they took everything very seriously. The detective who came to the house explained that there had been a series of burglaries in nearby neighborhoods during that time period, but they had never caught the perpetrator. The strange thing was, none of the families in the videos had ever reported being robbed. The investigation hit a dead end pretty quickly. The elderly couple who sold me the house had both passed away just a month after moving to Arizona. Natural causes, according to their death certificates. The detective told me the VHS tapes and notebooks would be kept as evidence, but since no actual crime could be proven from the materials, there wasn't much they could do. I spent weeks researching newspaper archives from that period, looking for any reports of break-ins or suspicious activity in the area. I found a few articles about valuables going missing from homes, but nothing was ever definitively connected. The most unsettling part was that some of the addresses mentioned in the articles matched locations from the notebooks. What really keeps me up at night isn't the thought of someone watching those families. It's the other things I found in that space. Small personal items that must have come from different houses. A child's hair ribbon, a single earring, a broken refrigerator magnet. each one carefully wrapped in tissue paper and labeled with a date and address. None of them valuable, just meaningless trinkets that wouldn't be missed, taken from people who never knew they were being watched. I still live in the house. The police said there's no reason to believe whoever made those tapes is still active. The dates on everything stopped in 2008, and the technology used was outdated even then. But sometimes when I'm working in my front yard, I notice things that make me uncomfortable. How many cars drive by slowly, their windows tinted just dark enough that you can't see who's inside? How many people walk their dogs past the same house multiple times a day? How easy it is to see into someone's windows from the right angle, especially at night. Last week, while planting new bushes along my fence, I found something buried in the soil, an old mini cassette recorder, the kind used for dictation. The tape inside was too degraded to play, but the label was still readable. Notes for December 2008. I turned it in to the detective handling the case, but I haven't heard anything back. I try not to think about why the recording suddenly stopped that month, or what might have happened to make someone abandon their years of careful surveillance. The detective suggested I seal up the space under the floor and try to move on. I did, installing new carpet and trying to forget what I found. But lately I've been noticing little things that seem out of place in my house. A coffee cup that's not quite where I left it. A window that's unlocked when I'm sure I locked it. A drawer that's open just a crack when it should be closed. Small things. Things I could easily be imagining. Things that nobody would notice unless they were specifically looking for them. When I bought the house, I thought I was making the best decision of my life. It was a 3-bedroom home built in the late 1980s, sitting at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The previous owners had left in a hurry, job relocation, they said. But aside from a few scuff marks on the walls and an outdated kitchen, it was in good shape. The price had seemed almost too good to be true, but I didn't question it. A home inspector found no serious issues, and within a few weeks I had the keys in hand. The first few nights were peaceful. There was a slight creak in the hallway floorboards that I attributed to settling wood, and an occasional draft that whistled through the vents, but nothing that gave me any real concern. It wasn't until I started my renovation projects that I discovered what had been hidden behind those walls for decades. It began with the master bedroom. The wallpaper was an awful shade of faded peach, peeling in places, and I wanted to replace it with something modern. As I pulled it down, I noticed a section of the drywall that looked different, almost patched over. Curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a hammer, tapping against it until I found a hollow spot. One solid hit and a section of the wall crumbled away. What I saw made my stomach drop. Inside the gap, wedged between wooden beams and insulation, was something pale and crumbling. At first I thought it was just debris, old wood maybe, but as I reached in, my fingers grazed something hard and smooth. I yanked my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. It took me a second to process what I was looking at, a bone, human by the size of it. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the ladder I'd been standing on. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. After a moment, I forced myself to take another look, peeling away more of the drywall. That's when I saw the skull. It was small, too small. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was a child's skull. My legs felt weak and I sank onto the bed, my breath coming in short gasps. I had no idea what to do. Call the police, that was the logical answer. But as I reached for my phone, a terrible thought crept into my mind. How long had this been here? How had no one noticed? And most importantly, who had put it here? I forced myself to dial 911, my fingers trembling so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. The dispatcher kept their voice calm as they asked me questions, but I could barely focus on my own answers. Within hours, squad cars and forensic teams were parked outside my house, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The officers took one look inside the wall and knew this was no accident. They began peeling away more of the drywall, revealing more remains, carefully buried and hidden away. A forensic expert murmured something about the condition of the bones, how they had been there for decades, maybe since the house was first built. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering to each other, but no one had any answers. The house's history was unremarkable. No reports of missing persons tied to this neighborhood, no unsolved crimes. It was as if these bones had been erased from existence until I found them. Over the next few weeks, investigators worked tirelessly. They ran forensic tests, checked dental records, and scoured missing persons reports. But the results only deepened the mystery. There were no matches. No one seemed to be looking for this child. I spent countless nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had happened here. Had someone in the past buried their secret within these walls, confident it would never be uncovered? Had they lived here afterward, sleeping peacefully just inches away from their crime? Or had the remains been hidden by someone before the house was even finished, sealed away like a dark stain that no one was ever supposed to find? One of the detectives told me something that still haunts me. He said that in some cases like this, the perpetrator is long gone, their crime forgotten by time. The child might have never been reported missing, either because no one cared, or because the very people who were supposed to protect them were the ones responsible. The case remains unsolved. I couldn't stay in that house. Even after the police finished their investigation, even after the bones were taken away and forensic teams scrubbed the place clean, I couldn't bring myself to sleep there again. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air always heavy, as if the house still carried the weight of its secret. I sold it at a loss, leaving behind nothing but the memory of what I had found. To this day, I wonder who that child was. If they ever had someone who loved them, someone who cried for them. And worst of all, I wonder how many other houses hold secrets just like this one, waiting for someone like me to peel away the walls and let the truth breathe again. When I first set foot in the house, it smelled of dust and old wood. The real estate agent, a woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, assured me that the previous owner had been an old man who lived alone for decades. He had passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving behind a lifetime of possessions. The house had been on the market for a while, she admitted, mostly because of its outdated decor and the sheer number of things left behind. I didn't mind. I was looking for something with character, something that felt lived in, a fresh coat of paint and some new furniture, and it would be perfect. The price was almost suspiciously low, but I chalked it up to the market. So I signed the papers and moved in, eager to start my new chapter. It wasn't until I began unpacking that I noticed the objects, strange, unsettling things that had been left behind. Not the usual forgotten furniture or leftover dishes, but items that felt deliberate, as though someone had meant for them to stay. The first was an old wooden box, tucked away in the attic behind stacks of yellowed newspapers. It was carved with intricate patterns, the kind that made my fingertips tingle when I traced them. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all black and white, all capturing different people in various states of distress. Some looked directly at the camera, their eyes wide with fear. Others had their backs turned, their shoulders hunched as if bracing for something unseen. The worst ones, though, were the ones where people appeared to be looking at something just outside the frame, their mouths slightly open, caught mid-gasp. There were no names, no dates, nothing to indicate who they were or why they had been photographed, just frozen moments of unease. Then there was the chair. An antique rocking chair, to be precise, sitting in the corner of the basement, positioned as if someone had just stood up from it. Unlike the rest of the house, the basement had almost no dust, as if it had been used regularly. I only noticed the carvings on the armrests after I ran my fingers over them absent-mindedly. Not decorative flourishes, but small, shallow grooves, marks left behind by fingernails digging into the wood. I found more as the days went on. A child's doll missing an eye, with its remaining glass pupil strangely misaligned, giving it the unsettling illusion of movement. A locked journal whose pages had been violently torn out, leaving behind jagged remnants still attached to the spine. A collection of teeth in a glass jar, their origins impossible to determine. Each object on its own was eerie but explainable. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I asked the real estate agent if she knew anything about the house's history, but she only offered vague details. The previous owner had lived there alone, no family, no friends who visited. When I pressed her, she hesitated before admitting that the man had been something of a hoarder, collecting things he found interesting. That was the word she used, interesting. Not valuable, not sentimental, just interesting. At night, I found myself lying awake, thinking about the objects. Where had they come from? Who had they belonged to? Why had they been left behind? I considered throwing them away, but every time I picked one up, I felt an inexplicable hesitation. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't mine to discard, like they were waiting for something. It wasn't until I found the photographs hidden in the walls that I knew I had to leave. The house had many layers, literally. While removing old wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, I discovered a gap between the wall and the plaster beneath. Curious, I reached in and pulled out an envelope thick with photographs. Unlike the ones in the attic, these were newer, printed on glossy paper. And unlike the ones before, these didn't feature strangers. They featured me, unpacking boxes, sitting on my couch, sleeping in my bed. Some were taken through windows, others from inside the house itself. There was no doubt about it. Someone had been watching me from the moment I moved in, and whoever it was, they had been inside. I didn't bother packing. I grabbed my keys, walked out the front door, and never looked back. The house still stands, its windows dark and unblinking. Someone else will move in eventually. Maybe they'll find the objects, and maybe they won't. Maybe they'll leave them where they are, like I did. Or maybe, just maybe, they'll add something of their own to the collection.